My name is Sarah, and at 28 years old, I thought I had found my perfect Christian husband, a man who spoke passionately about purity, led Bible studies on faithfulness, and made our entire church community believe we were the ideal couple. For 40 days after our wedding, he wouldn't touch me, claiming he was spiritually preparing our marriage while I slept alone wondering what was wrong with me. But the night I opened his laptop and saw those browser tabs, live cam sites, private chats, and credit card statements totaling thousands, I realized the man preaching about holiness every Sunday had been living a double life that would shock everyone who knew him. The moment I printed that evidence and walked into court, his carefully constructed world of lies came crashing down in ways that left the entire congregation speechless. If this story resonates with you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories about deception, betrayal, and finding the strength to reclaim your life. Sarah Martinez had always believed that God had a plan for her love life. At 28, she'd watched countless friends find their soulmates while she remained single, teaching third grade at Valley Christian Academy and leading the women's Bible study at Grace Community Church. Her mother would often remind her that God's timing is perfect, but some nights, alone in her small apartment, Sarah wondered if she'd been forgotten. That changed on a crisp October Sunday when Pastor Williams introduced the congregation to their new men's ministry leader. David Chin stood at the podium with an easy confidence that immediately caught Sarah's attention. He was handsome in an understated way, dark hair neatly styled, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than practiced. I believe that authentic Christian manhood is about serving others, protecting the vulnerable, and living with integrity in every area of life, David said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. I'm excited to journey alongside the men of this congregation as we pursue God's heart together. After the service, Sarah found herself lingering in the fellowship hall, hoping for an introduction. She didn't have to wait long. David approached her with 2 cups of coffee and that same warm smile. "You must be Sarah," he said, offering her a cup. "Pastor Williams mentioned you lead the women's Bible study. I've heard wonderful things about your ministry." Their first conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. David listened intently as Sarah shared her passion for teaching, her heart for missions work, and her dreams of starting a Christian family someday. Unlike other men she'd dated, he didn't seem bored by her faith or uncomfortable when she mentioned wanting to honor God in her relationships. "I've been praying for a woman who truly loves the Lord," David confided as they walked to the parking lot. "Someone who understands that marriage is a ministry, not just a personal choice." Their first official date was a prayer walk through the local park. David brought his well-worn Bible and shared insights about Scripture that impressed Sarah with their depth and sincerity. He spoke passionately about purity, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual purity. "I believe in guarding my heart," he explained as they sat on a bench overlooking the pond. "I've made mistakes in past relationships by getting too emotionally involved too quickly. This time, I want to do things God's way." Sarah felt her heart skip. Finally, a man who shared her values completely. Over the following months, their relationship blossomed in what felt like a perfect Christian romance. They attended church together, prayed together, and spent hours discussing theology and their future dreams. David was respectful of boundaries, never pressuring Sarah physically and always steering their relationship towards spiritual growth. "I want to honor you," he would say when moments grew intimate. "You're precious to God, and that makes you precious to me." The church community embraced them as a couple. Pastor Williams often commented on how blessed they were to have found each other. Sarah's best friend, Jennifer, was almost envious. "He's like something out of a Christian romance novel," Jennifer said one evening as they planned Sarah's bridal shower. "The way he looks at you during worship, how he opens doors, how he remembers little things you mention. Girl, you hit the jackpot." David proposed on their 1-year anniversary at the exact spot where they'd had their first prayer walk. He got down on one knee right after sunset, with fairy lights he'd secretly strung in the trees twinkling above them. "Sarah Elizabeth Martinez," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you are a gift from God." Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife and ministry partner for life? The ring was simple but elegant, exactly what Sarah had dreamed of. But more than the ring, it was the way David's eyes filled with tears as he spoke about their future that made her heart soar. This was the man God had been preparing for her all along. Their engagement was celebrated by everyone who knew them. David's men's Bible study threw them a party, and the women's ministry insisted on hosting the bridal shower. Wedding planning became a community affair, with church members volunteering everything from flowers to photography. You two are what Christian marriage should look like, Mrs. Peterson, the elderly church pianist, told Sarah during the bridal shower. That young man of yours has such a pure heart. You can see God's light in his eyes. During their premarital counseling sessions with Pastor Williams, David consistently impressed their pastor with his maturity and commitment to biblical principles. David has a deep understanding of what it means to be a spiritual leader, Pastor Williams told Sarah privately. You're blessed to have found someone so grounded in his faith. The only moments that gave Sarah any pause were small, so small she dismissed them. Sometimes David seemed to know too much about temptation, speaking with unusual specificity about the struggles young men face. His phone was always face down, and he was particular about privacy, but he explained it as maintaining healthy boundaries. I believe in being accountable, he told Sarah when she casually mentioned his phone habits. I have software that monitors my internet usage and sends reports to my accountability partner. It's just good wisdom for any Christian man. Sarah admired his dedication to purity. If anything, it made her more confident in her choice. Their wedding day dawned perfect, clear skies, gentle breeze, and the sanctuary filled with everyone they loved. Sarah felt like a princess in her simple but elegant dress, and when the doors opened and she saw David waiting at the altar, tears of joy streamed down her face. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, but it was the expression on his face that took her breath away. He was crying too, his hand over his heart as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The ceremony was everything Sarah had dreamed of. David's vows were beautiful and heartfelt. Sarah, you are God's perfect gift to me. I promise to honor you in purity and truth, to protect your heart as carefully as I guard my own, and to lead our family with the integrity that Christ has shown me. I will love you faithfully, purely, and completely, all the days of my life. There wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Even the photographer wiped away tears as David tenderly kissed his bride for the first time. The reception was joyful but modest, reflecting their shared values. Instead of an expensive honeymoon abroad, they'd chosen a charming bed and breakfast in the mountains, a place where they could begin their marriage in peace and prayer. As they drove away from the reception, tin cans trailing behind David's car and "Just Married" soap scripted on the windows, Sarah felt complete. God had been faithful. Her patience had been rewarded. She was married to a man who would honor and cherish her exactly as the Bible described. The Mountain View bed and breakfast was everything the website had promised, a cozy Victorian cottage nestled among towering pines, with a stone fireplace and a view that stretched for miles. Sarah had imagined this moment countless times, being alone with her husband for the first time, beginning their physical relationship with the blessing of God and community. But something felt wrong almost immediately. David was quiet during the drive up the mountain, which Sarah initially attributed to wedding day exhaustion. He'd been animated during the reception, laughing with friends and dancing with her to their first song, but now he seemed distant, almost nervous. Are you okay? She asked as they carried their suitcases into the charming suite. You seem tired. Just processing everything, David replied, setting down his luggage and walking to the window instead of approaching her. It's been a big day. Sarah had expected some nervousness. It was natural for both of them. They'd saved themselves for marriage, which meant tonight would be special for both of them. She'd read Christian marriage books that prepared her for the adjustment period, the importance of patience and communication. But as the evening progressed, David's distance became more pronounced. They had a lovely dinner by candlelight, prayed together thanking God for their marriage, but when it came time for bed, David hesitated. I think I need a shower, he said, gathering his clothes. to, prepare myself properly. He disappeared into the bathroom for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was wearing full pajamas, not what Sarah had expected for their wedding night. She had changed into the beautiful negligee her married sister had given her as a wedding gift, but David barely glanced at her. "You look beautiful," he said quickly, then turned away. "I think I need to pray for a few minutes to center myself spiritually." Sarah tried to be understanding. "Of course. We can pray together if you'd like." "No, I need some personal time with God first," David replied, kneeling beside his side of the bed. "This is a sacred transition. I want to make sure I'm approaching it with the right heart." He prayed for 20 minutes, while Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, feeling increasingly awkward and confused. When he finally got under the covers, he maintained careful distance between them. "I think we should take things slowly," David said into the darkness. "I don't want to rush into anything physical. God has blessed us with forever. We don't need to hurry." Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. "But David, we're married now. It's okay for us to." "I know what's okay," David interrupted, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard. "But I also know what's wise. Some couples ruin their marriages by being too focused on physical things right away. I want to honor you by taking time to develop our spiritual intimacy first." The next morning brought no change in David's behavior. He was kind but distant, suggesting they spend the day hiking and reading scripture together rather than enjoying the romantic atmosphere of the cottage. When Sarah suggested they stay in bed a little longer, David was already dressed and ready for devotions. "I think it's important we start our marriage with good disciplines," he explained, his Bible already open on the small table by the window. "Physical intimacy will develop naturally as our spiritual bond deepens." Sarah tried to convince herself this was normal, even admirable. Maybe David was just more mature about marriage than she was. But as days passed, his explanations became more elaborate and strange. "I've been praying about our physical relationship," he announced on day 4 of their honeymoon. "And I believe God is calling us to a period of spiritual preparation. Like the priests in the Old Testament who had to purify themselves before entering the holy place." "David, I've never heard of such a thing," Sarah said carefully. "Where in the Bible does it talk about married couples needing spiritual preparation for intimacy?" "It's not explicitly stated," David replied, his tone taking on the same authority he used during Bible studies. "But the principles are there. Some Christians are more sensitive to spiritual matters than others. I don't want to defile our marriage bed by approaching it carelessly." Sarah felt a stab of hurt. "Defile? David, we're married. God created physical intimacy for marriage." "Of course," David said quickly. "I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying timing matters. We need to make sure we're both spiritually prepared." That night, David moved to the small couch in their suite, claiming he needed space to seek God's guidance about their marriage bed. Sarah lay alone in the king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering what was wrong with her. Was she too eager? Too focused on physical things? Had she misunderstood what Christian marriage was supposed to look like? She called her sister Maria from the bathroom the next morning, whispering so David wouldn't overhear. "He says what?" Maria's voice was incredulous. "Sarah, I've been married for 8 years. Tom and I went to the same premarital counseling. There's no such thing as a spiritual preparation period after marriage. You are married. That's the preparation." "But what if he's right?" Sarah asked. "What if I'm being too worldly about this?" "Honey, listen to me. Physical intimacy in marriage is God's design. It's not worldly to want to connect with your husband. Something doesn't sound right here." But Sarah wasn't ready to believe something was fundamentally wrong with David. She'd watched him lead Bible studies, pray with genuine emotion, serve others selflessly. He had to be sincere. The rest of their honeymoon passed in a strange limbo. David was affectionate in public, holding her hand during walks, kissing her cheek during prayers, but completely distant in private. He spent increasing amounts of time on his laptop, claiming he was preparing for the men's retreat he would lead the following month. "I don't want to get behind on ministry just because we're on our honeymoon," he explained when Sarah questioned the late-night typing. "God's work doesn't take vacations." Sarah tried to peek at his screen once. curious about what ministry materials required such intense late-night focus, but David quickly closed the laptop. "It's still in rough draft form," he said. "I don't want anyone to see it until it's polished." When they returned home to their small rented house, Sarah hoped things would improve. But David's behavior became even more puzzling. He insisted on separate bedrooms, temporarily, claiming he was still seeking God's guidance about their physical relationship. "I've been praying, and I believe God wants us to wait 40 days, David announced during their first week back. "Like Jesus in the wilderness or Moses on the mountain. It's a period of consecration." 40 days. Sarah's voice cracked. "David, that's almost 6 weeks total since our wedding. This isn't normal." "Who defines normal?" David replied. "The world or God?" "I thought you wanted a biblical marriage, Sarah." The way he said her name, with just a hint of condescension, made Sarah's stomach clench. But she pushed aside her discomfort. Maybe she was being impatient. Maybe God was teaching her something through this trial. David's behavior patterns became more established during those weeks. He maintained his public persona perfectly, still led the men's Bible study with passion, still served communion with reverence, still spoke lovingly about marriage to their church friends. But at home, he was increasingly cold and dismissive. "Some wives would be grateful to have a husband who takes spiritual matters seriously," he said when Sarah tried once again to discuss their lack of physical intimacy. "But I guess not everyone is called to the deeper things of God." His laptop habits became more pronounced. He would stay up until well past midnight, the glow of the screen visible under his bedroom door. When Sarah asked about it, his explanations grew more elaborate. "I'm developing a comprehensive teaching series on purity," he would say. "It requires extensive research into the temptations modern Christians face. You wouldn't understand the depth of preparation required." Sarah began to notice other strange things. Bills for services she didn't recognize. David being secretive about his phone, always keeping it face down, and taking it with him even to the bathroom. When she mentioned it casually, his response was sharp. "I value privacy," he said. "Not everything needs to be shared, even in marriage. Healthy boundaries are important." But these weren't the healthy boundaries they discussed in premarital counseling. These felt like walls. 3 weeks after their honeymoon, Sarah finally reached her breaking point. David had just returned from leading a Bible study on God's design for marriage, during which several wives had complimented Sarah on having such a godly, devoted husband. "David," she said as he settled at his laptop for another late-night session, "we need to talk about our marriage. Really talk." "What's to discuss?" he replied without looking up from his screen. "We're exactly where God wants us to be." "Are we?" Sarah's voice was stronger than she felt. "Because I'm lonely, confused, and starting to wonder if you actually want to be married to me." David finally looked up, and for just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Irritation? Annoyance? Then his expression smoothed back into patient understanding. "Sarah, I know this is difficult for you, but some people are more spiritually sensitive than others. What looks like rejection is actually protection. I'm protecting both of us from entering into physical intimacy before we're spiritually ready." "And when will we be ready?" Sarah asked. "When will you know?" "When God tells me," David replied simply. "I thought you trusted my spiritual leadership." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had always believed in biblical submission, in trusting her husband's spiritual discernment. But something deep inside her was beginning to rebel against this particular interpretation of leadership. "I do trust you," she said carefully. "But I also trust God's design for marriage. And this doesn't feel like what he intended." David's face hardened. "I see. So, you think you understand God's will better than your husband does? That's not very submissive, Sarah." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. Sarah felt something shift inside her. A small crack in the foundation of trust she'd built her marriage on. Sarah woke up the next morning with David's words still ringing in her ears. "That's not very submissive, Sarah." The tone had been so cold, so unlike the gentle man who'd courted her with such care and respect. As she made coffee in their small kitchen, watching David get ready for work with his usual efficiency, she tried to shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed between them. But it wasn't just his tone that bothered her, it was the pattern she was beginning to see. David's public persona remained flawless. At church that Sunday, she watched him pray with genuine seeming emotion during the service, saw him embrace other men with warmth during fellowship time, listened to him speak knowledgeably about scripture during adult Sunday school. Yet the moment they got home, he became distant and dismissive again. Great lesson today, she ventured as they changed out of their church clothes. David replied, already reaching for his laptop. I need to prepare for the men's retreat next weekend. It was always the men's retreat, or a Bible study, or research for some teaching series. Sarah had been a pastor's kid. She'd grown up around ministry preparation. She knew what it looked like, and David's late-night computer sessions didn't match any ministry work she'd ever witnessed. That week, she began paying closer attention to the details she'd previously dismissed. David's phone was never visible, always in his pocket, always face down when set aside. When it rang, he would glance at the screen with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read before either answering briefly or letting it go to voicemail. Work call, he would explain, or someone from the men's group, but he never elaborated. His laptop habits were becoming more pronounced too. Some nights, she would wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. to see the glow of his screen still visible under his bedroom door. When she mentioned her concern about his sleep schedule, David brushed her off. Ministry requires sacrifice, he said. Paul worked day and night for the gospel. I'm just following his example. But Paul hadn't been married. And Sarah was beginning to doubt that whatever David was doing in those late-night sessions was actually ministry-related. The financial aspects started bothering her too. They'd combined their accounts after marriage, and Sarah handled most of their day-to-day banking. She began noticing charges she didn't recognize, small amounts to various online services, some with cryptic company names that didn't seem related to ministry or work. When she asked David about them, his explanations were always plausible but vague. Online resources for research, or ministry tools, or work-related software subscriptions. Can you show me? Sarah asked one evening, genuinely curious about what resources he was using. I'd love to learn more about your ministry preparation process. David's response was immediate and defensive. Why do you need to see everything I do? Don't you trust me? Of course I trust you, Sarah replied quickly. I just thought. You thought you needed to supervise my ministry work? David's voice had that sharp edge again. I didn't realize I married a woman who needed to control every aspect of her husband's calling. The conversation ended there, but Sarah felt stung by his characterization of her innocent question as controlling. Was she being too suspicious? Too demanding? Her mother had always warned her about wives who didn't trust their husbands, who became nagging and demanding instead of supportive and encouraging. But late at night, lying alone in her bed while David worked on his mysterious projects, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. 3 weeks into their marriage, Sarah's sister Maria visited for an afternoon. As they sat on the back porch drinking iced tea, Maria asked the question Sarah had been dreading. How's married life treating you, sis? You seem tired. Sarah forced a smile. Oh, just adjusting to sharing space with someone new. And how's the physical adjustment going? Maria asked gently. I remember those first few weeks can be awkward but sweet. Sarah's carefully maintained composure cracked. We're taking things slowly. Maria's eyebrows rose. Slowly? Sarah, you've been married almost a month. David believes in spiritual preparation, Sarah explained, hating how defensive she sounded. He wants to make sure we're approaching physical intimacy with the right heart. Spiritual preparation for what? You're already married. God already blessed your union in front of 200 witnesses. I know, but nothing. Maria interrupted gently. Honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Has David given you any concrete timeline for when this spiritual preparation will be complete? Sarah opened her mouth to defend David, then closed it. The truth was, his explanations kept changing. First it had been a few days of adjustment. Then it was seeking God's guidance. Then it was 40 days like Jesus in the wilderness. But when she'd asked for specifics, David had become vague and defensive. "He says when God tells him we're ready," Sarah admitted quietly. "And in the meantime, what does he do with his time?" "Ministry work, research, Bible study preparation." "At 3 a.m.? Sarah looked up sharply. "How did you?" "I got up to use the bathroom last night and saw his light on." "Sarah, what kind of ministry work requires someone to be on their computer until dawn?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah realized she didn't have a good answer. That evening, Sarah made a decision that felt both necessary and frightening. She would pay closer attention to David's behavior, not to spy on him or violate his privacy, but to understand what was really happening in their marriage. She started with the small things. When David said he was going to the grocery store, she noticed he was gone for 2 hours but returned with only a few items. When he claimed to be preparing for Bible study, she listened carefully to his actual lesson the next week and realized it bore no resemblance to the intensive research he'd supposedly been doing. Most telling were the phone calls. David had always been social, fielding calls from church members and friends regularly. But now his phone conversations were brief, secretive, and often conducted outside or in closed rooms. The few times she overheard fragments, the tone of his voice was different, less pastoral, more casual, sometimes even flirtatious in a way that made her stomach clench. "Who was that?" she asked after one particularly long call he'd taken in the garage. "Just someone from work," David replied, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "It sounded like you were laughing a lot for a work call." "We have a good team," David said curtly. "Is there a problem with me enjoying my colleagues' company?" Again, Sarah felt like she was being painted as controlling for asking normal questions about her husband's day. The breaking point came during their 5th week of marriage. Sarah had been feeling unwell, stress-induced insomnia, and stomach problems that she attributed to the adjustment difficulties of their marriage. She'd left work early and come home to rest, expecting the house to be empty since David was supposedly at a men's ministry planning meeting. But his car was in the driveway. Sarah entered quietly, thinking perhaps the meeting had been canceled and David was taking a rare afternoon to rest. But as she climbed the stairs, she could hear him talking, not on the phone, but to his computer. His bedroom door was slightly ajar, and the tone of his voice made her freeze. He was using language she'd never heard from him, casual, intimate, flirtatious. She caught fragments. "You look beautiful today, and I wish I could." "And that sounds amazing." Sarah's heart began pounding. She moved closer to the door, trying to understand what she was hearing. Through the crack, she could see David sitting at his laptop, his back to the door, speaking to someone on screen. The conversation was definitely not ministry-related. She backed away quietly, her mind racing. Who was he talking to? And why was he speaking to them like he spoke to her during their courtship? That night, David maintained his usual routine, distracted during dinner, claiming he needed to work on ministry projects after they cleaned up, disappearing into his room with his laptop until well after midnight. But now Sarah couldn't unhear the tone she'd caught that afternoon. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the David who led passionate Bible studies about purity and faithfulness with the David who spoke intimately to strangers on his computer, while his wife of 5 weeks slept alone in the next room. By morning, Sarah had made a decision that terrified her. She needed to know the truth about what David was doing during those late-night computer sessions. She needed to understand why her husband of barely a month was more interested in his laptop than in her. For the next few days, she watched David's patterns more carefully. He was most active on his computer between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. He always cleared his browser history. She'd noticed that much when she'd used his laptop once to check email. His phone was constantly with him, even in the shower. But David had one vulnerability in his careful system. He trusted her completely. It had never occurred to him that his devoted Christian wife might investigate his activities. After all, she was supposed to trust his spiritual leadership, to submit to his judgment about their marriage and his ministry calling. That trust would be his undoing. On Thursday night, exactly 35 days after their wedding, David announced he had to attend an emergency men's ministry meeting. "Crisis counseling situation," he explained as he grabbed his keys. "Could be late." Sarah nodded supportively, kissed him goodbye, and watched from the window as he drove away. Then she walked directly to his bedroom and opened his laptop. Her hands shook as the screen came to life. David hadn't logged out of anything. Browser tabs were still open. And what Sarah saw in those first few seconds would shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband, her marriage, and herself. Multiple tabs displayed adult websites, chat rooms, live cam services, private message windows with women whose profile pictures left nothing to the imagination, credit card purchase confirmations, saved usernames and passwords for dozens of accounts across different platforms. Sarah sank onto David's bed, staring at the screen in horror. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a brief struggle with temptation. This was an elaborate, ongoing deception that had clearly been happening throughout their entire relationship, maybe even during their wedding day, given some of the timestamps she was seeing. With trembling hands, she began to document everything. Screenshots, credit card statements, chat logs where David had shared intimate details about their marriage, their home, even photos of their bedroom. Evidence of scheduled private sessions with multiple women. Financial records showing hundreds of dollars spent on adult entertainment. As she worked, the full scope of David's betrayal became clear. He hadn't been struggling with his spiritual calling or seeking God's guidance about their marriage. He had been living a complete double life, using his reputation as a godly man to manipulate her while indulging in exactly the kind of behavior he preached against every week. The spiritual preparation he'd insisted on wasn't about honoring God or protecting their marriage. It was about maintaining his secret life, without interference from an inconvenient wife. Sarah printed everything, her tears falling on the pages as they emerged from the printer. The man she had married, the man she had trusted with her heart and her future, didn't exist. The real David was a stranger, a manipulator who had used her faith against her, who had made her question her own desires and instincts while he pursued his hidden obsessions. By the time she heard his car in the driveway an hour later, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of evidence in front of her. Her hands had stopped shaking.
Her tears had dried.
And for the first time in weeks, she knew exactly what she needed to say to her husband. The front door opened, and David called out cheerfully, "Honey, I'm home. Sorry I'm so late. You know how these ministry emergencies can be." Sarah looked up as he entered the kitchen, and she saw the exact moment he noticed the papers on the table. His face went completely white, and the mask he'd worn so carefully for months finally slipped completely away. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "And this time, David, we're going to tell each other the truth." David stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slideshow: shock, fear, calculation, and finally, something Sarah had never seen before: cold anger. The cheerful mask he'd worn for so many months had completely dissolved, leaving behind a stranger who looked at her with undisguised irritation. "Sarah," he said slowly, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she was beginning to recognize, "I can explain whatever you think you've found." "Think I've found?" Sarah's voice remained steady as she lifted the first page from her stack. "David, this is a credit card statement showing $847 spent on something called Sexy Chat Premium Services during our engagement. What exactly do you think needs explaining?" David's jaw tightened. He stepped into the kitchen and closed the door behind him, an action that would have seemed natural weeks ago but now felt vaguely threatening. "You went through my private things," he said, deflecting rather than answering. "That's a violation of trust, Sarah. A violation of our marriage vows." The audacity of his response hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I violated our marriage vows. David, I have screenshots of you having explicit conversations with other women during our honeymoon. You scheduled a private session with someone called Sweet Angel 23 on our wedding day. It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Sarah stood up, spreading more papers across the table. "Because I also have chat logs where you described our bedroom to someone named Kitty Cat, where you complained about your frigid wife, to a woman called Dream Girl, and where you sent pictures of our house, our home, David, to complete strangers." Each revelation landed like a physical blow. David's face grew paler, but instead of shame or remorse, Sarah saw something worse: annoyance at being caught. "You don't understand men's struggles," David said, his voice taking on the condescending tone that now made Sarah's skin crawl. "This is just fantasy. It's not real. I never actually met any of these women." "Fantasy." Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "You spent nearly $2,000 of our money we were saving for a house, on your fantasies? You shared intimate details about our marriage with strangers while refusing to touch your own wife." "It's not the same thing," David insisted, but his arguments were becoming increasingly desperate. "Physical adultery and this are completely different categories of sin." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Did you just categorize your sins for me? David, you've been living a double life since before we were married. You've manipulated me using scripture, made me question my own desires and instincts, all while you were doing exactly what you preached against every Sunday." "I never preached against this specifically. You preached about purity, about faithfulness, about honoring your wife." Sarah's composure finally cracked. "You led Bible studies about guarding your heart while you were giving pieces of it away to women whose names you don't even know." David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him recalculating his approach. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more like the man she had fallen in love with. "Sarah, you're right. I have a problem. But it's an addiction, not a choice. I've been struggling with this for years. Even before I met you. I thought marriage would fix it. But instead you decided to blame me for your inability to stop," Sarah interrupted. "All that talk about spiritual preparation, about my lack of submission, that was just cover for the fact that you were getting your needs met elsewhere." "It wasn't about you," David said, but even he seemed to realize how hollow that sounded. "Wasn't it?" Sarah picked up another printout. "Because according to this chat from last Tuesday, you told Candy Love that your wife was uptight and frigid, and that you needed a real woman who understood pleasure. How exactly was that not about me?" David's face flushed. "I was frustrated. I said things I didn't mean." "You said things you wouldn't say to my face," Sarah corrected. "You told strangers our private business, while making me feel like there was something wrong with me for wanting intimacy with my own husband." The room fell silent except for the tick of the kitchen clock. Sarah watched David cycle through what she now recognized as his standard manipulation tactics: denial, minimization, blame-shifting, spiritual language, and finally, when all else failed, making himself the victim. "I need help," he said finally, his voice breaking in just the right way. "Sarah, I'm sick. This is an addiction, and I need my wife's support to overcome it. Isn't that what marriage is about? For better or worse?" For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar tug of sympathy. This was the David she had fallen in love with, vulnerable, seeking, in need of grace. But then she remembered the cold calculation in his eyes when he first saw the evidence, the immediate lies, the way he'd tried to turn her discovery into her violation of trust. "How long?" she asked quietly. "What? How long have you been doing this? Not the addiction part, the lying part. How long have you been pretending to be someone you're not?" David was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "I don't know what you want me to say, Sarah. I want you to tell me the truth. For once in our entire relationship, I want you to tell me who you really are." Something shifted in David's posture, and Sarah saw a glimpse of the real man behind all the personas he'd worn. "The truth." His laugh was bitter. "The truth is that I never wanted to be the man everyone expected me to be. The truth is that leading Bible studies and talking about purity and being everyone's spiritual example is exhausting. The truth is that sometimes I just wanted to be human without everyone analyzing my every move for signs of godliness." "So you decided to lie instead?" "I decided to give people what they wanted to see," David said, his voice growing harder. "The church wanted a spiritual leader. You wanted a pure Christian husband. My family wanted a son they could be proud of. So I gave everyone their perfect David while I took care of my real needs privately." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Your real needs?"
"Yes.
"My real needs. Not everyone is cut out for the saint life," Sarah. Some of us need outlets that don't involve judgment and expectations and constant performance. Is that what our marriage was to you? A performance? David looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, Sarah saw the answer before he spoke it. Everything is a performance, he said quietly. The question is whether you're good at it or not. The brutally honest words hung between them like a death sentence. Sarah realized she was looking at a man she had never actually known, someone who had studied her, learned what she wanted to hear, and delivered it with perfect precision while maintaining a completely separate existence. The spiritual preparation, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The 40 days. All of it was just to keep me from interfering with your real life. You wanted a spiritual husband, David said with a shrug. I gave you reasons to be proud of my self-control. Sarah sat down heavily in her chair, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. She hadn't just been betrayed, she had been systematically deceived by someone who had studied manipulation like a science. The men's Bible study, she said, pieces clicking into place. All those times you talked about purity and faithfulness, were you laughing at us? At me? I was doing my job, David replied. And I was good at it. Everyone loved Pastor David and his beautiful wife. We were the perfect Christian couple. We were a lie. We were what everyone needed us to be. Sarah looked down at the papers scattered across the table, evidence of thousands of dollars spent, hundreds of hours invested, intimate conversations with countless strangers, all while she had slept alone in the next room wondering what was wrong with her. I want you to leave, she said quietly. Sarah. Tonight. I want you to pack your things and leave tonight. Where am I supposed to go? Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she felt nothing. No love, no pity, no concern for his well-being. Just emptiness, where her feelings used to be. I don't care, she said. Go stay with one of your online girlfriends. Maybe they'll appreciate the real you more than I did. David didn't leave that night. Instead, he launched into the most sophisticated manipulation campaign Sarah had ever witnessed, cycling through every emotional tactic with the skill of someone who had clearly done this before. First came the spiritual angle. Sarah, God hates divorce. Are you really going to give up on our marriage without even trying counseling? What would Pastor Williams say? When Sarah remained unmoved, David shifted to self-pity. I'm a broken man who needs healing, not abandonment. I thought I was marrying someone who understood grace and forgiveness. Then came anger. So you're perfect now? You're going to throw away everything we built because of some computer files? This is exactly the kind of pride that destroys Christian marriages. Finally, when nothing else worked, came the threats. If you leave me, you'll destroy my ministry. Is that what you want? To be responsible for damaging God's kingdom because you couldn't handle being married to a flawed man. Sarah listened to all of it with a growing sense of clarity. Each manipulation tactic revealed more about who David really was, someone who saw every relationship as a game to be won, every person as a resource to be managed. I'm calling Pastor Williams in the morning, she said calmly. I'm going to tell him exactly what I found and let him decide what to do about your ministry position. David's face went white. Sarah, you can't. Think about what this will do to the church, to our witness in the community. I'm thinking about what your behavior has already done to our witness, Sarah replied. I'm thinking about the women in your Bible study who look up to you, who bring their husbands to learn about faithfulness from a man who spends thousands of dollars chatting with cam girls. It's not the same thing. Stop, Sarah interrupted. Just stop. I've heard all your justifications, and they're all variations of the same theme. Everyone else is wrong. Everyone else doesn't understand. Everyone else is being unreasonable. You're never the problem, David. It's always circumstances, or addiction, or other people's expectations, or spiritual warfare. Never just the simple truth that you're selfish and dishonest. David stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. When did you become so hard? When I married someone who turned out to be a stranger, Sarah replied. Pack your things, David. I'll give you until tomorrow night, and then I'm changing the locks. The next morning, while David was at work, Sarah made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Pastor Williams. The elderly pastor listened in stunned silence as Sarah laid out the evidence she discovered, reading selected portions of chat logs and credit card statements. When she finished, there was a long pause. "Sarah," Pastor Williams said finally, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I am so very sorry.
I don't know what to say."
David has been such a respected leader in our congregation." "That's exactly the problem," Sarah replied. "He's been playing a role so well that no one saw the real person underneath." "What do you need from me?" the pastor asked. "I need the church leadership to know what kind of man has been leading Bible studies about purity and faithfulness. I need David to face consequences for his actions instead of being protected by his reputation." The second call was to her sister Maria, who immediately offered to drive over with a lawyer friend. "I knew something was wrong," Maria said. "I've been praying for weeks that God would reveal whatever was happening in your marriage." "He certainly answered that prayer," Sarah said grimly. The third call was the hardest to her parents. Her father, a retired pastor himself, wept openly when Sarah explained the situation. "Honey," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so proud of you for having the strength to face this. So many women would have made excuses or tried to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed." By afternoon, word had begun to spread through the church community. Pastor Williams had called an emergency meeting with the Board of Deacons, and David's carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Sarah was in the kitchen when David came home early from work, his face grim. "You told them," he said without preamble. "I told the truth. You destroyed my life." Sarah looked at him with something approaching pity. "David, you destroyed your own life. I just stopped helping you hide the damage." "The deacons want to meet with me tonight," David continued, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "Pastor Williams says they're considering removing me from all leadership positions." Good. David's voice rose. "Sarah, this will ruin me. Do you understand that? My reputation, my ministry, my relationships, everything I've built will be gone." "Everything you built was a lie," Sarah replied calmly. "Maybe it's time you tried building something real." "And what about us? What about our marriage?" Sarah had been dreading this question, but now that it came, she felt only relief at being able to answer honestly. "There is no us, David. There never was. There was the real you living a secret life, and there was the fake you performing for everyone else, including me. I married someone who doesn't exist. People can change." "Can they?" Sarah interrupted. "Because in the last 24 hours, you've lied to me, manipulated me, tried to blame me, and threatened me. You've shown anger about being caught, but no genuine remorse for what you did. You're upset about consequences, not about the betrayal. That doesn't sound like someone who's changed or even wants to change." David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth or spirituality. "So that's it? You're just going to throw away 2 years of relationship because I'm not perfect?" "No," Sarah said. "I'm going to end a marriage that was based on fraud because I deserve better than being lied to and manipulated by someone who sees me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to love." That evening, while David faced the church deacons, Sarah met with Maria's lawyer friend, Janet Chin, no relation to David, despite the shared surname. "Based on what you've shown me," Janet said, reviewing Sarah's documentation, "you have grounds for annulment rather than divorce. David misrepresented himself fundamentally during your courtship. This wasn't just bad behavior after marriage. This was ongoing deception that predates your wedding." "What's the difference?" Sarah asked. "Divorce says the marriage failed," Janet explained. "Annulment says the marriage was invalid from the beginning because one party was fraudulent. Given the evidence of his double life during your engagement and the financial deception, we can argue you never gave informed consent to marry the real David Chin." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. How long would that take? With this much documentation? Probably 3 to 6 months. "And Sarah, you should know that some of those websites he was using might have records of his activity. If he was sharing personal information about you or photos of your home, there might be legal implications beyond just the annulment." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal meetings, difficult conversations, and the gradual unraveling of the life Sarah had thought she was building. David moved out of their house and back in with his parents, whose shock and denial gradually gave way to anger and blame, directed primarily at Sarah for refusing to forgive and destroying their son's reputation. The church community's reaction was mixed. Some members rallied around Sarah, expressing outrage at David's deception and admiration for her courage in exposing the truth. Others blamed her for not trying harder to save her marriage, for being unforgiving, for airing private matters publicly. "Some people are saying you should have handled this privately," Jennifer told Sarah one evening as they sorted through wedding gifts that would need to be returned. "That you should have given David a chance to get help." "I did handle it privately at first," Sarah replied. "I tried to understand, tried to be patient, tried to trust his spiritual leadership. All that got me was more manipulation and lies. And as for getting help, David never admitted he had a problem until he got caught. That's not repentance. That's damage control." The hardest part was the constant second-guessing from well-meaning friends and family members who couldn't understand why Sarah wouldn't fight for her marriage. "Marriage is work," her aunt said during a difficult family dinner. "No one is perfect. Maybe if you had been more supportive of David's struggles." "David didn't have struggles," Sarah interrupted, her patience finally exhausted. "David had deliberate choices. He chose to live a double life. He chose to spend our money on other women. He chose to manipulate me using scripture. He chose to make me feel defective for wanting intimacy with my own husband. Those weren't struggles, they were calculated decisions." But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Peterson, the elderly pianist who had gushed about David's pure heart during the bridal shower. "I just think," Mrs. Peterson said after church one Sunday, "that maybe if you had been a more attentive wife, David wouldn't have needed to seek comfort elsewhere. Men have needs, dear." Sarah stared at the older woman in disbelief. "Mrs. Peterson, David and I never had physical intimacy. He refused to touch me for our entire marriage while spending thousands of dollars on other women. How exactly was I supposed to be more attentive?" Mrs. Peterson's face flushed, but she pressed on. "Well, there are other ways to meet a man's needs. Emotional support, encouragement." "I gave him nothing but support and encouragement," Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "I defended his late-night computer sessions to my sister. I made excuses for his distance to my friends. I questioned my own desires because he told me I wasn't spiritual enough. I literally blamed myself for his rejection while he was having intimate conversations with strangers. What more support was I supposed to provide?" Mrs. Peterson had no answer, but her disapproving expression made her position clear. In her world, marriage problems were always the wife's fault, and divorce was always the greater sin than the behavior that caused it. It was Pastor Williams who finally provided the perspective Sarah needed to move forward with confidence. "Sarah," he said during one of their counseling sessions, "I've been in ministry for 37 years. I've seen every kind of marriage problem you can imagine. What David did wasn't a marriage problem, it was character problem. And character problems can't be fixed by the person being damaged by them." "But shouldn't I have tried harder?" Sarah asked. "Shouldn't I have given him more chances to change?" Pastor Williams leaned forward in his chair. "How many chances do you give someone to stop lying to you? How many times do you forgive someone who shows no genuine remorse?" "Sarah, biblical forgiveness doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. It doesn't mean staying in a relationship with someone who refuses to acknowledge the harm they've caused." The deacons removed him from all leadership positions, Pastor Williams continued. But even in that meeting, David's primary concern was his reputation, not the people he'd deceived or the example he'd set. "That tells me everything I need to know about his heart condition." 3 months after she'd discovered David's double life, Sarah sat in a courtroom listening to a judge review the evidence for their annulment petition. David's lawyer had tried to argue that his behavior, while inappropriate, didn't constitute fraud sufficient to invalidate the marriage. But Janet had been thorough in her preparation. She presented credit card statements showing David's spending patterns during their engagement, chat logs where he discussed his upcoming wedding while making plans for post-marriage encounters with online partners, and evidence that he'd used church equipment to access inappropriate websites during ministry events. "Your Honor," Janet said in her closing argument. The respondent didn't simply develop problems after marriage. He systematically deceived the petitioner about his character, his values, and his intentions throughout their entire courtship. Mrs. Chen married someone who doesn't exist. The real David Chen was having explicit conversations with other women on their wedding day while publicly vowing faithfulness and purity. The judge's decision was swift and unequivocal, annulment granted, based on fraudulent misrepresentation of character and intentions. As they left the courthouse, David made one final attempt at reconciliation, or manipulation. "Sarah," he called out as she walked toward Janet's car. "I know I made mistakes, but we could start over. We could try again, do things differently." Sarah turned to look at him one last time. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his pastoral authority and community respect. But his eyes still held that calculating quality she'd learned to recognize. "David," she said quietly, "I don't think you understand what differently would mean. It would mean telling the truth, even when it's inconvenient. It would mean genuine remorse instead of self-pity. It would mean taking responsibility instead of blaming circumstances. It would mean caring more about the people you've hurt than about managing your image." She paused, studying his face for any sign that her words were penetrating. "But most importantly," she continued, "it would mean becoming a completely different person than who you've shown me you really are. And I don't think that's possible." David's expression hardened. "You'll regret this, Sarah. You'll realize what you've thrown away." Sarah felt a flash of the old intimidation, the doubt he'd been so skilled at creating. But it passed quickly, replaced by something stronger. "The only thing I regret," she said, "is not trusting my instincts sooner. Goodbye, David." 6 months after the annulment was finalized, Sarah was unpacking boxes in her new apartment, a bright, cheerful space that felt nothing like the house she'd shared with David. For the first time in over a year, she felt like she could breathe freely. The legal proceedings had been more complex than anyone anticipated. Janet had discovered that several of the websites David frequented had terms of service violations related to sharing personal information about non-consenting parties. When they found evidence that David had shared photos of their home and personal details about Sarah with his online contacts, Janet had filed additional complaints with both the websites and local authorities. "It's a form of violation," Janet had explained. "He was essentially using you as content for his entertainment without your knowledge or consent. That crosses legal lines beyond just marital fraud." The financial recovery had been significant. David's parents, horrified by the full scope of their son's behavior once all the evidence came to light, had insisted on reimbursing Sarah for the money he'd spent on his online activities. The total came to nearly $4,000, money that now helped furnish her new apartment and rebuild her life. But the most unexpected consequence had been the effect Sarah's story had on other women. It started with a quiet conversation after church one Sunday. Rebecca Morrison, a woman from the Young Marrieds group, approached Sarah hesitantly. "I hope you don't mind me asking," Rebecca said, "but could we talk privately sometime? About recognizing when something's not right in a marriage?" The conversation revealed that Rebecca's husband had been exhibiting some of the same patterns Sarah now recognized as red flags: excessive secrecy around technology, spiritual manipulation to avoid intimacy, financial inconsistencies he couldn't or wouldn't explain. "I keep thinking I'm being suspicious or untrusting," Rebecca confided. "But after hearing what you went through, I'm wondering if I should pay more attention to my instincts." Sarah helped Rebecca document her husband's behavior and connected her with Janet when the evidence revealed a similar pattern of online infidelity and financial deception. Rebecca's marriage ended in divorce, but she thanked Sarah repeatedly for giving her the courage to investigate and the framework to understand that her husband's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. Word spread quietly through various church communities. Sarah found herself in conversations with women who had been convinced their marital problems were their fault, who had been told they were too demanding or insufficiently supportive when they questioned their husband's secretive behavior. Pastor Williams approached Sarah about leading a support group for women dealing with deception in marriage. "Your experience has opened our eyes to patterns we've been missing," he admitted. "Too often, We've counseled women to be more submissive or forgiving without first ensuring they weren't being systematically deceived or manipulated. The support group started small, just 4 women meeting in the church library on Wednesday evenings. But as word spread, it grew to include women from multiple congregations and eventually required a larger meeting space. I spent 3 years thinking I was crazy, shared Michelle, whose husband had been having emotional affairs while serving as a marriage counselor. He used all the right Christian language about my need to trust and submit, while he was counseling other women about their marriage problems and developing inappropriate relationships with them. My husband told me that good Christian wives don't question their husband's financial decisions, added Lauren, whose spouse had been spending their savings on gambling websites while claiming the money was going to mission support. He made me feel guilty for wanting to see bank statements for our own accounts. Sarah realized that David's story wasn't unique. It was a pattern. Men who understood Christian culture well enough to weaponize it against their wives, using spiritual language to shut down legitimate questions and concerns. The group developed resources for recognizing spiritual manipulation, financial deception, and emotional abuse disguised as Christian leadership. They created practical guides for documenting suspicious behavior and connecting with legal and counseling resources. But the most important thing they provided was validation. The message that trusting your instincts isn't unsubmissive, that asking questions isn't controlling, and that holding someone accountable for their behavior isn't unforgiving. God gave you a mind and intuition for a reason, Sarah would tell new group members. If something feels wrong, if someone's words don't match their actions, if you're being told that questioning inconsistencies makes you a bad wife, those are signals worth investigating. A year after her annulment, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from David's mother. "Sarah," Mrs. Chin said, her voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology." And an explanation. The conversation that followed was revelatory. Mrs. Chin explained that David's behavior patterns had existed long before his marriage to Sarah. There had been problems in college with inappropriate online relationships, issues at his previous job related to misusing company computers, and a pattern of lying to family members about his activities and whereabouts. "We kept making excuses," Mrs. Chin admitted. "We thought if he found the right woman, got involved in ministry, had proper structure and accountability, he would change. We convinced ourselves that his problems were due to being single, to not having enough responsibility, to needing the right Christian influence. Instead," she continued, "we helped him find better ways to hide his behavior. We taught him the language that would make people trust him without question. We enabled him to become more sophisticated in his deception." Mrs. Chin revealed that David had moved back home after the annulment and attempted to restart his old patterns, but his parents had finally insisted he get professional help. The counseling had revealed the depth of his issues with honesty, empathy, and personal responsibility. "The counselor told us that David has what he called narcissistic personality traits," Mrs. Chin explained. "He sees other people primarily as sources of what he needs rather than as individuals with their own worth and feelings. That's why he could compartmentalize his behavior so completely, because in his mind, your feelings and needs were less important than his desires and reputation." She paused before continuing. "Sarah, I need you to know that what happened to you wasn't your fault in any way. David is skilled at finding exactly what someone wants to hear and delivering it convincingly. You couldn't have known he wasn't genuine because he had practiced being fake for so long that it looked real." The conversation provided Sarah with closure she hadn't realized she needed. The final piece of doubt, the whisper that maybe she hadn't tried hard enough, forgiven enough, been patient enough, finally disappeared. 2 years after discovering David's betrayal, Sarah stood in front of a new group of women at a weekend retreat focused on healthy relationships and spiritual discernment. Her story had become a cautionary tale and a source of hope throughout their denominational network. "I want to tell you about the man I thought I married," Sarah began, "and about the man I actually married. And I want to talk about the difference between Christian submission and Christian stupidity." The room filled with nervous laughter, but Sarah could see the recognition in several faces. Women who had been told that questioning or investigating their husband's behavior was unbiblical. "Biblical submission doesn't mean turning off your brain," Sarah continued. It doesn't mean ignoring red flags or making excuses for behavior that contradicts someone's claimed values. It doesn't mean accepting financial deception, emotional manipulation, or spiritual abuse because the person doing it uses the right Christian vocabulary. She shared practical tools: how to recognize gaslighting disguised as spiritual correction, how to document concerning behavior without violating privacy, how to distinguish between normal marital adjustment issues and systematic deception. But most importantly, Sarah concluded, I want you to know that if something feels wrong in your marriage, if someone's actions don't match their words, if you're being told that normal questions make you a bad wife, those feelings are valid. Your instincts are a gift from God, not something to be ignored in the name of submission. After her presentation, a young woman approached Sarah privately. Thank you for sharing your story, she said. I think I might be married to someone like David. Sarah smiled sadly but hopefully. Then let's talk. And let's get you the help you need. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. The woman who had once questioned every instinct, who had blamed herself for her husband's rejection, who had accepted spiritual manipulation as godly leadership, that woman felt like a different person. She had learned to trust herself again. She had found her voice. She had discovered that real love doesn't require you to ignore obvious problems or make excuses for inexcusable behavior. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maria. How did the retreat go? Really well, Sarah texted back. I think we helped some people today. I'm proud of you, Maria replied. You turned your worst experience into something that protects other women. That takes incredible strength. Sarah smiled as she pulled into her apartment complex. She had indeed found strength she didn't know she possessed. But more than that, she had found peace, the peace that comes from living authentically, from refusing to accept less than she deserved, from using her pain to prevent others from experiencing similar betrayal. The life she was building now was nothing like what she had planned 2 years ago. It was smaller in some ways, no shared dreams of a large family or ministry partnership. But it was also larger, filled with genuine relationships, meaningful work, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you will and won't accept. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter that would close the final chapter of her old life. David had been arrested for cyberstalking after one of his online contacts discovered he had been sharing private photos and personal information about her without consent. The same patterns that had destroyed their marriage had continued and escalated until they crossed clear legal boundaries. Sarah felt no satisfaction in David's legal troubles, but she felt profound relief that his ability to manipulate and deceive others was finally being limited by external consequences. The women in her support group had often wondered what happened to men like David when they faced no real accountability. Now they had their answer. That evening, Sarah sat in her comfortable living room, working on materials for the next support group meeting. Her apartment was quiet but not lonely, filled with books and plants and photos of genuine moments with family and friends who knew and loved the real her. Her phone rang, and she smiled when she saw the caller ID. Rebecca, the first woman Sarah had helped recognize the signs of deception in her marriage. Sarah, I have news, Rebecca said, her voice bright with excitement. I met someone. Someone real this time. Someone whose words match his actions and who doesn't need to be secretive about anything because he has nothing to hide. I'm so happy for you, Sarah said, and meant it completely. I wanted to thank you again, Rebecca continued, for showing me that my instincts were right, for teaching me what questions to ask, for helping me understand that I deserved better than what I was accepting. After they hung up, Sarah returned to her work with a deep sense of satisfaction. She had taken the worst experience of her life and transformed it into something that protected and empowered other women. She had refused to let David's deception make her bitter or mistrustful of everyone. Instead, she had learned to distinguish between appropriate caution and paralyzing fear, between healthy boundaries and walls, between discernment and cynicism. The woman who had once been so easily deceived had become someone who could spot manipulation from across a room. The woman who had once questioned every instinct now trusted herself completely. The woman who had once made excuses for inexcusable behavior now held people accountable with compassion but clarity. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she offered a prayer of gratitude, not for the betrayal she had experienced, but for the strength she had discovered, the wisdom she had gained, and the women whose lives had been changed because she had found the courage to speak her truth. The spiritual deception that had nearly destroyed her had instead become the foundation for a ministry of truth, healing, and empowerment that would continue long after David Chen was forgotten by everyone except the legal system. And in the quiet of her peaceful apartment, Sarah finally understood what genuine happiness felt like. Not the performance of joy for others' approval, but the deep contentment that comes from living authentically, loving wisely, and using your experiences to make the world a little bit safer for those who come after you. Have you ever wondered how many people in your life might be wearing masks so convincing that you'd never suspect the truth underneath? Hit that like button if this story opened your eyes, and subscribe for more shocking tales of deception, betrayal, and the courage it takes to face reality.